Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to a very special episode of Contemplating Life, episode 66. You might have noticed this episode is extremely late. I've been busy trying not to die. The title of the episode is I Was Nearly Murdered, and that's only a slight exaggeration. It was more like a negligent homicide, but my life was still at risk. And that doesn't include the health challenges that I've had recently. In the past 45 days, I've been in 2 different hospitals 4 times, and that doesn't include an in-and-out trip to the ER to get my G-tube replaced on May 5th. Let's start at the beginning. So, let's see. The Earth formed and the dinosaurs came and went. No. We're not going to do that again. We will give you a flashback to the day I was born, but let's start this story with Saturday, April 13, 2024. I've been having some respiratory issues for a couple of days, and by that Saturday, it was bad enough I thought I needed to get checked out at the hospital. I took an ambulance to St. Vincent Hospital on West 86th Street here in Indianapolis. St. Vincent is the only hospital I've ever been to. Well, actually, it's been 2 different St. Vincent hospitals. There have been 4 locations of St. Vincent Hospital over its history. It was founded in 1881 by Indianapolis Bishop Silas Francis Chattard, along with a religious order called the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. I highly encourage you to read the article I linked in the description chronicling the history of the hospital. It's fascinating stuff. But for our purposes, my story starts with the 3rd incarnation of St. Vincent Hospital on Fall Creek Boulevard between Capitol Avenue and Illinois Street. That was the hospital where I was born, as were 50% of all children born in Indianapolis between 1913 and 1974. The St. Vincent Hospital on West 86th Street is the only other hospital I'd ever been in. It was opened in 1974, and I believe my first visit would have been in the spring of '79. Anyway, back to April 13, 2024. A chest x-ray confirmed what I suspected. I had some mild pneumonia in my lower left lung. I was admitted to the hospital and put on IV antibiotics. Anytime I'm admitted to the hospital, I have to go to the ICU because I use a ventilator to help me sleep at night. It's not that I'm ventilator dependent. It's more like an overblown CPAP machine. But you can't use a CPAP when you have a trach. Sometimes I feel guilty about being in the ICU when I'm not really very sick. But that's their policy, and I like the extra attention. The nurses enjoy taking care of a patient who isn't critically ill. It was an uneventful stay, and I was out 2 days later on Monday the 15th. I was confident I was fully recovered. They sent me home with oral antibiotics, which I completed. Everything was okay after that. The next significant event was Tuesday, May 7, when my friend Rich came over to help me repair my 3D printer. I have a Prusa Mark III that I purchased about 6 years ago, and it's given me wonderful service up until recently. I had a failed print that resulted in a huge glob of melted plastic spread all over the extruder, and it's taken me several attempts to recover from this failure. Several months ago, when I still didn't have the printer working properly, it was going to cost me at least $100 just to get someone to look at it. There was a new Micro Center store open on the northeast side of town. They had a cheap Chinese Creality printer that usually lists for $450, but it was on sale for only $150. I desperately needed a 3D printer, and it was just too good a deal to pass up. I've regretted that decision ever since. The machine works, but it just doesn't work as well as my good old Prusa. You get what you pay for. I still don't have the money to pay for someone to look at the old machine. I thought perhaps Rich and I might be able to do something with it ourselves, since I didn't like the new printer. I was pretty sure all I needed to do was reinstall the nozzle in the extruder. It was leaking plastic around the edges. When we got the old nozzle out, it was in pretty bad shape, so we decided to replace it completely. Fortunately, I had several in stock. The normal operating temperature for a 3D printer is between 210 and 230 degrees centigrade, depending on the plastic you use. The instructions for replacing a nozzle said you should crank up the temperature to about 270 C. From my previous misadventures with the printer, there was melted plastic all over the heat block. At that temperature, PLA plastic will vaporize into smoke, and it's possible that the PETG plastic that the printer is made from could also melt, although I don't think it did. Now, vaporized PLA plastic doesn't smell very bad, but it does tend to stick in your sinuses, and you continue to smell it for a day or so. At one point, we opened the window and turned on my ceiling fan. Part of the problem was that neither Rich or I knew what we were doing, so we had to have the thing overheated longer than would have been necessary. On a previous occasion, when I tried to remove that big blob of plastic from the failed print, my roommate Josh helped me clear it by melting the plastic away with a soldering iron. That also had created vapors that stuck in my sinuses. A few days later, I noticed I had a lot of secretions in my lungs, and I had to do more trach suctioning than usual. It was more than a week until things got back to normal. Still, it was manageable. While Rich and I were working, we should have opened the windows sooner, but I kept thinking, we're almost done. It turns out it's harder than you think to screw a tiny nozzle that's 270 degrees. We'd done this before, and I didn't have very good tools, but it was still difficult to do even when I had the right size metric socket wrench. On the following day, I could still smell burnt plastic, but I didn't notice anything wrong with my lungs. By the second day, Thursday, May 9th, I had to begin doing excessive amounts of trach suctioning, and that continued through the weekend. I figured it was the same thing that happened when I inhaled the fumes when Josh was helping me. At the same time, my roommate Barb had been having recurring intestinal issues, but she woke up Monday morning, May 13th, with severe breathing difficulty. As my home health aide was getting me dressed, Barb's son Josh told me that Barb needed to go to the hospital. I said, no problem. I'll get someone to come stay with me. As soon as I was up in my wheelchair, I began calling friends and quickly found someone who could be here in about a half hour. Josh called 911, and the paramedics from Fire Station 31, just a few blocks away, arrived. I went in the living room and found Barb sitting on the sofa, gasping for air. The paramedics put an oximeter on her finger, and it registered in the low 80s. It should be well above 90%. Josh had already given her one breathing treatment, but the paramedics put her on oxygen and more nebulizer medication. By the time the ambulance arrived, a minute or two later, her oxygen was back up to 90. The entire incident was quite scary for me and everyone involved, and it will have long-lasting consequences that I may discuss in future episodes. My friends Stu and Pat Byram arrived about 20 minutes later to stay with me. Josh took off to the hospital to be with his mom. My friends and I picked out a movie to watch, but it was interrupted frequently because I needed trach suctioning. Patty has done it many times before, but we were having a particularly difficult time getting it cleared. I could tell she was concerned, but I kept trying to reassure her that everything was okay. Somewhere along the way, I developed a low-grade fever of just over 100. Tylenol took care of it easily. My sister arrived about 6 p.m. to take over my care, and my home health aide also returned to put me back to bed. Each Tuesday and Thursday, I have a respite nurse who stays with me from 9:30 a.m. until 4 p.m., so my roommates can have time to go to the doctor, run errands, or just get out of the house for a while. I kept Nurse Tony busy all afternoon Tuesday doing breathing treatments and suctioning. By the time she left at 4 p.m., she was worn out, and I was in pretty good shape. My friend Judy arrived to stay with me until my sister Carol could relieve her. I think Judy only had to do perhaps one suctioning, if at all. There was a miscommunication with my home health aide, entirely my fault, as to whether or not I needed her for the evening shift. So Carol ended up putting me to bed, and by then I was needing yet more suctioning. Carol noted that my secretions were extremely thick. They had turned yellow instead of the usual clear or white, and some of it even looked a bit chunky. Also, my fever had returned. Carol suggested I needed to go to the hospital, and I quickly agreed. This was more than just a little irritation from the 3D printer fumes. It was likely that whatever had sent Barb to the hospital the day before was giving me fits as well. Or even if it was just the irritation from the fumes, it was way beyond anything I'd experienced previously. I packed up everything I needed, being prepared to stay in the hospital. We packed my laptop, and I got my ventilator ready to transport, because I like to use my own vent when I'm in the hospital. I would go by ambulance, and Carol would bring my stuff in her car in case I was admitted. Again, I was pretty sure I would be. Anytime I go to the hospital, we have to clear out my bedroom. We moved my wheelchair, my bedside table, and my Hoyer patient lift to make room for them to bring a gurney in and drag me over onto it. We also have to move a small sofa table in the living room to make it easier to get the gurney down the hallway. It's quite a production to get me in an ambulance. It's a good thing I've not had to do it in a dire emergency. The ambulance arrived, and they loaded me up for a trip to St. Vincent. Along the way, I had a pleasant conversation with a medic who rode in the back with me. She had just gotten back from a trip to Disney World. I asked, "Did your kids enjoy it?" She chuckled and said, I don't have any kids. It was just me and my boyfriend." She explained that she had family in the area and was visiting them, but the highlight was the trip to Disney. Whenever the ambulance is about 5 minutes away from the hospital, they get on the radio and ask the dispatcher for a line to the hospital ER. They report a description of the patient, my vitals, and what I'm coming in for. The dispatcher notified them that St. Vincent was on full diversion. They were not accepting any EMS patients. Apparently, on May 8th, the entire Ascension Healthcare network of over 140 facilities spread across 20 states was hit by a ransomware cyber attack. They had to shut down their entire network and start using paper record keeping. They had no access to old patient records from previous visits. and although the ER was open to walk-in patients, they were not accepting EMS patients. The question now was, where do I go? As I mentioned, I'd never been to any other hospital. I asked them, well, what's the closest? The choices were Indiana University Methodist Hospital or Eskenazi Hospital. I didn't have a coin to flip, so I picked Methodist because that's where they take injured IndyCar drivers. While I had not hit a concrete wall at 230 miles per hour, I figured if it was good enough for the Indy drivers, it was good enough for me. I had my iPhone with me, so I had the medic call Carol, who was also just a few minutes from St. Vincent. We both turned around and headed for Methodist. When I arrived at the ER, at first they were just going to put me behind a curtain, but when I explained that I needed suctioning, they moved me to a small ER room. I was seen by a resident doctor almost immediately, which is unusual. Then again, I'm usually in for something minor, like a G-tube replacement or a urinary infection. When you come in with breathing difficulty, you get quicker attention. They started an IV, drew blood, and took me for a chest x-ray. At St. Vincent, they used portable x-ray machines, but at Methodist, the x-ray department is right down the hall from the ER, so they just move you there and move you back. When I returned from the x-ray, Carol was waiting for me. She'd stopped to grab a bite to eat on the way. She knew it was going to be a long evening, and she was right. Carol and I passed the time talking about the day's events and our concerns about Barb, who by now had a confirmed diagnosis of pneumonia and was still in the hospital. Finally, the resident returned to tell me there was a slight fogginess in my chest x-ray that could be pneumonia. He said, "You had to do extensive breathing treatments and suctioning. Do you have what you need at home to treat this?" Much to my surprise, I answered no. When I thought about the difficulty that Pat had suctioning me on Monday, and the excessive amount of work I put Nurse Tony through earlier that day, as well as the friends I had lined up to take care of me on Wednesday, I did not have sufficient backup to deal with this crisis of my own. The doctor replied, "That's all I need to hear. We'll admit you." In retrospect, even if Barb had not been in the hospital, and I had all the support I usually have and that I needed, I really did need to be admitted. And I don't think I would have had any difficulty convincing them of that. I think it was more of a case of, if you really, really want to go home, I guess I can release you, but if you want to stay, then stay. I needed to stay. Unlike St. Vincent, which automatically sends me to the ICU, whether I'm in need of intensive care or not, Methodist Hospital has a pulmonary care unit, and they would be sending me there. Unfortunately, it's a small unit, and it took until the following afternoon to get me in a room in the PCU. I sent Carol home around 2 a.m. I did not want to get on the ventilator until I was settled into my new room. I didn't want to be moved when I could not communicate while on the vent. I can sleep a little bit without the vent, and I estimated I might have gotten at max 3 hours sleep. The next challenge I faced involved my G-tube. About a year ago, I had my G-tube replaced, like I do about every 6 months. There's a new style of G-tube with a different type of fitting on top called an N-fit fitting, E-N-F-I-T. It screws on about a half twist. It's unique to feeding systems. That's a safety feature, so you can't accidentally put IV medication into a G-tube, or worse yet, put feeding formula into an IV. Unfortunately, Methodist Hospital had never heard of it. They didn't have any syringes that would connect to my G-tube. That means they couldn't give me any medication by grinding up the pills in water and giving them to me via my G-tube. They had to partially disassemble the G-tube in a way it wasn't intended to be disassembled in order to give me medication. It also meant I would not be able to get G-tube feedings. So the next morning, Carol brought a half a dozen or so of my infit syringes from home. It wasn't until about 2 p.m. Wednesday afternoon that I was finally able to get a G-tube feeding. That was 23 hours since my previous feeding. Being dehydrated and not getting any nutrition or calories is not good for the healing process. Normally at St. Vincent, they let me use my ventilator from home, but at Methodist, they wanted me to use their ventilator. That was okay. I was a little bit ambivalent about it, but it ended up not giving me any trouble. I had a very nice nurse who checked me into my room in the PCU on Wednesday afternoon. I don't recall her name. They have a shift change at 6 p.m. I was used to 7 p.m. at St. Vincent. No big deal. It was just something else that was different. Anyway, the new night nurse seemed quite friendly. She appeared to be in her late 50s, or perhaps 60 years old. She said something like, "I'm sorry you're going to lose your cute young nurse. I guess you're stuck with an old battle axe like me." I didn't mind. She exuded an air of confidence that in her many years of nursing, she had seen and done everything. She is what's known as a traveling nurse. These nurses are not employed directly by the hospital, but are on a contract with them for a few months at a time. I explained that I needed to get on the vent soon, because I only had 3 hours of sleep. I explained to her the signals I use when I can't talk while I'm on the ventilator. If I wiggle my eyebrows up and down, that means yes. If I twitch my mouth left and right, that means no. If I make a clicking noise with my tongue, that means I want their attention. I was quite explicit. If you can't figure out what I want after a couple of yes or no questions, just call the respiratory therapist to take me off the ventilator temporarily, and then I can talk and tell you what I want. She seemed to understand. I explained I wasn't able to use any of the various types of nurse call buttons that they have available, so she agreed to check in on me periodically. Despite my lack of sleep, the tension of everything that was going on kept me awake. Around midnight, she checked in, and I clicked my tongue to get her attention. I was going to need to get off the vent so I could direct her on how to comfortably put me on the bedpan. I was hoping she would ask me a couple of yes or no questions and then call respiratory. But she didn't. She seemed hell-bent on trying to figure out what I wanted, but she was no good at reading lips. All I was saying was, "Call respiratory, call respiratory." Rather than do as we agreed, she brought in another young nurse in an attempt to read my lips. But that nurse had no more luck than did Nurse Battleaxe. At one point they asked, "Do you want off the ventilator?" And I signaled, "Yes." Now before we proceed, I need to explain briefly how a trach works. It's a simple curved tube, 7 millimeters in diameter, which enters my windpipe through a hole in my neck. There's a cap on the outside called a passing mirror speaking valve. It's a one-way valve that allows air to be inhaled. But when you try to talk or to exhale, the valve closes the trach, allowing the air to come up your windpipe and across your vocal cords so you can speak. When you're on the ventilator, you remove the valve and attach a hose from the vent on the outside of the trach where the valve once was. Air comes into your lungs through the vent hose. However, it could escape back out your mouth and your nose, which is no good. The bottom end of the trach tube is surrounded by an inflatable cuff or balloon. There's a tiny tube that extends from the trach, and you inject air into that tube, and it blows up the inner cuff. This inflated cuff blocks off your upper airway so that the air coming from the vent doesn't escape out your nose and mouth. Instead, when you exhale through the trach, it goes into the vent tubing and out an exhaust port. On the end of that tiny tube, there's a small balloon that's an indicator how much air is in the trach cuff. When the tiny balloon on the outside is inflated, you know that the inner cuff is inflated. When you remove me from the vent, you have to connect a little syringe to that tube and extract all of the air. When the external balloon is flat, you know the internal cuff is flat. Now, if you put on the speaking valve, which is one way in, but you do not deflate the cuff, your airway is totally blocked. You can inhale, but you cannot exhale. That's what happened. The nurse removed the hose from my trach and replaced the speaking valve without deflating the cuff. I began frantically signaling, "No, no, no," and clicking my tongue, but she proceeded anyway. I was totally unable to breathe. Eventually, she sensed the panic I was experiencing and removed the valve, allowing me to breathe. My airway was totally blocked for at least 20 seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. On several occasions, my dad, my roommate Barb, and perhaps my sister Carol have accidentally forgotten to deflate the cuff before putting on the valve. I just click my tongue a couple of times, and they say, "Oh crap, I nearly killed you," and they quickly remove the valve, and we all laugh about it. In a future episode, I'll tell you about the first time my dad did that. But that's not what happened here. This wasn't a, "Oh crap, I forgot." This nurse was totally clueless about what she was doing. She had no idea whatsoever that you needed to deflate the cuff first. The other nurse stood there and watched, and she was similarly unaware that I was unable to breathe at all because of their actions. It was bad enough that I couldn't breathe for nearly 20 seconds. But had they chosen to give up at that point, leave the room, and call the respiratory therapist, I would have passed out. Fortunately, I was connected to an oximeter and a heart monitor, but they would have had to call a code to resuscitate me. And even if they were able to do it successfully, I probably would have ended up with broken ribs at least. Given my overall weak condition, and the fact that I was weak from my illness, they might not have been able to resuscitate me at all. I could have been dead. Fortunately, they removed the valve, put me back on the vent, and then called the respiratory therapist to take me off properly. The therapist took me off the vent, but I needed my trach suctioned before I could speak clearly. I insisted that the nurse not leave the room until I could speak to her. When I could speak and breathe easily, I explained to her in no uncertain terms that she had nearly murdered me, and I used those words. I described exactly what she did wrong. The respiratory therapist who was standing there was appalled. After I said my piece, I explained that the reason I was calling is I wanted to get on the bedpan. She got me on the bedpan. I did my business. She got me off. I told her I didn't want to get back on the ventilator. I was too scared to be in that situation again. I tried to get to sleep, but I couldn't. Eventually, when she came back in, around 3 a.m., I told her, call respiratory and have them put me back on the vent. And keep your damn hands off of it until I get it off. I told respiratory I wanted it off about 6 a.m. when the shift changed, and she agreed. During that time, I might have gotten 3 more hours of sleep, but maybe not that much. The next morning, I spoke to the day nurse, who was the same one I had before, who was very nice. I explained to her what had happened, but she had already heard. News of the incident was spreading fast. I told her I wanted to speak to a supervisor. She sent in a woman named Olivia, who was the charge nurse for the unit. Olivia had already had a meeting with the supervisor of respiratory therapy. I explained in great detail my version of the series of events. She told me it wasn't just my request that the nurse should have called respiratory to take me off the vent. It's their absolute policy that they're not to touch the ventilator, and they should call respiratory therapy. I told her, it's even more disturbing that you had one nurse doing something she wasn't trained to do. But it violated not only my instructions, but your policy. The thing that really concerns me is there was another nurse standing there watching, and she was just as clueless as to what was going on. You have 2 nurses in the pulmonary care unit who have no idea how a trach works and who violated policy while watching one another. 1 is a mistake. 2 indicates a pattern. You have a systemic problem in this unit. And the bottom line is, even if you promise me I never get either of those nurses again, I can't trust this unit. I'm leaving here today. If the doctor will not discharge me, I'm leaving AMA. By the way, I won't bother philosophizing about the coincidence that the letters AMA stand for Against Medical Advice and also American Medical Association. There has to be a joke in there somewhere, but I haven't got the time to figure one out. Anyways, the charge nurse was highly apologetic and very sympathetic. She understood why I felt the way I did. I told her I'm not the kind of guy who's going to file a lawsuit or call a press conference. In retrospect, however, I could have called the police and had the woman arrested. The bottom line was I wasn't going to stick around and risk my life. Just call it a teachable moment, but I'm not staying. I was later visited by the unit supervisor, who was also appropriately sympathetic and apologetic over the incident. I gave her the exact same speech I gave the charge nurse. When my doctor arrived for rounds that morning, I told her what happened. I asked, am I okay to leave? I knew her answer would be no, and it was no. Then I told her, under the circumstances, I have no choice but to check myself out AMA. She said she would prescribe oral antibiotics, and I explained I would be going back to St. Vincent at the earliest opportunity. Now, sometime before I spoke to all of these supervisors, I had the day nurse set up my laptop computer on the bedside table. I made a voice call by Facebook Messenger to my sister Carol. Carol, it's me. You always said any time I didn't feel safe, I should call you. Well, I don't feel safe here. The nurse didn't know what she was doing and tried to take me off the vent wrong. She put the speaking valve on without deflating the balloon, and I couldn't breathe for nearly 20 seconds. This wasn't one of those oops, I forgot. She was totally clueless as to what she was doing. She had no idea she nearly killed me. If she hadn't removed the valve when she did, I could have been dead. Carol has been babysitting her 1-year-old grandson for my niece Elena. My niece was off work that day because she was going on a field trip with her other daughter, Keely. I told Carol, don't ruin their field trip, but if you can get someone else to cover for your babysitting, can you come stay with me until we can get the ambulance to bring me home? If not, I'll just go home after 6 p.m. whenever you can get there. Of course, Carol was furious about what happened to me. She said she'd get back to me as soon as possible. She contacted her other daughter, Heather, and Heather agreed to fill in babysitting. Soon after, Carol messaged me back. Don't bother with the ambulance. I'm coming up there with your wheelchair and your clothes and the van. I'll get you dressed, up in a wheelchair, and out of that place. I was ecstatic. I checked with the nurse to see if they had a Hoyer lift. They said yes, and I messaged Carol. It was mid-afternoon when Carol arrived. Not only had she brought my clothes, my back brace, and my wheelchair, she also brought our lift from home. She said I wasn't sure if I knew how to work their lift, so just in case, I brought ours. It was not easy to get my wheelchair and the lift in and out of our van. It reminded me of the kind of thing my mother would have done under the circumstances. Carol was in full tiger mom mode, and nothing was going to get in her way of getting me out of that place. Carol is 60 years old. Now, although she's capable of getting me dressed and into the wheelchair, typically we have my home health aide do it when Carol's taking care of me. It's really difficult for Carol to do it, but I think she did so in record time. One of the male nurses gave her a little assistance positioning me in the wheelchair once she had transferred me using the lift. That's always easier as a two-person job. We packed up all my belongings and got ready to leave. They said they were giving me oral antibiotics to take home. I thought they were going to deliver it to my room, but I had to pick it up at the public pharmacy in the lobby. Carol is both my designated medical representative and has power of attorney, so she signed the release form that I could be discharged AMA. I asked if there were other discharge papers or instructions, and they said, nope, not when you go AMA. On the way out, I saw the charge nurse, Olivia, and I thanked her and my day shift nurse for understanding. I said, I don't want to cast aspersions on the entire facility. Everyone else has been quite nice to me, but I just can't stay here. It looked as though the nurses were all about to have a big meeting. My guess is there were a lot of big meetings as a result of this incident, although I haven't talked to any of them since then. I don't know what the end result was. When we got to the lobby, the pharmacy where we needed to pick up my antibiotics was at the far end of the building. We had to go all the way over there, pick up the drugs, go all the way back. We loaded up the lift in the van, which again was not easy, and we were finally off. Carol offered to take me directly to St. Vincent as a walk-in patient, but I explained I had at most 6 hours sleep in the past 48 hours. I wanted desperately to get home in my own bed with my trusty emergency call button and my own ventilator. I knew if I went to St. Vincent, it would probably be hours before I could get to sleep. I was so exhausted and so stressed, I was seriously worried I'd have a heart attack or something if I didn't get to sleep quickly. When we got home, Carol had to drag me and the Hoyer lift out of the van, reassemble the lift, put me back to bed, get me undressed, give me my afternoon G-tube feeding, and get me on the ventilator. It was exhausting for her, considering she was up in the middle of the night 2 nights ago with me in the ER. Josh was at home. He had left his mom at the hospital because she needed to rest and wouldn't do so if he was there. So he helped out setting up the lift, and he set up my laptop. Now I mentioned my home emergency call button. It's a little device with push buttons I hold in my right hand. It allows me to operate my TV, cable box, iPad, and a buzzer that rings in the living room and master bedroom when I need something. A previous version of the box had a battery backup in case of a power outage. But my latest version plugs into my laptop because I figure it's got a bigger battery than anything I would put in the little box. Unfortunately, when we were plugging in the power on the laptop, the power cable didn't get plugged in all the way. So in the middle of the night, the laptop battery went dead and my push buttons became unusable. It was my fault for not double-checking it, but I was a zombie at that point. I got my G-tube feeding, got on the ventilator, and fell asleep about 6 p.m. I woke up about midnight to discover my buttons were not working. I thought maybe Carol would come in, because I was supposed to get another G-tube feeding, but she let me sleep. Now the only way of getting someone's attention is by making that clicking noise with my tongue. I could hear that Josh was still awake, watching TV or playing games online. And when I determined he was no longer using his headphones, I tried clicking as loudly as I could from time to time. About 2 a.m., he realized what that clicking sound was. He thought perhaps it was Barb's pet hedgehog making noises. Anyway, he realized it was me, and he woke up Carol. Carol had to do a breathing treatment, massive suctioning, and another G-tube feeding. All of that took about 90 minutes. We finally all got back to sleep around 3:30 a.m. The next morning, Carol had to go babysit her grandson again. So Josh would stay with me until about 10 a.m. when my friend Rich would come. My home health aide, Kira, arrived around 9 a.m. She gave me a bath, got me dressed, and got me up in my wheelchair. Then she stuck around a little longer to help me and Rich pack everything up for me to go to St. Vincent in my wheelchair van as a walk-in. Kira is really a blessing in my life, as are all of the people I mentioned. Well, that is except for the ones that tried to kill me. Anyway, it was quite a struggle for Rich to get me in the ventilator into the van. He's only a year younger than me. We carefully packed everything in 2 bags. One contained my suction machine, just in case we need to pull over en route to the hospital and suction my trach. The other contained my laptop. Rich would drive up to the ER entrance, unload me, and bring the suction machine back. There's valet parking at the ER that would park the van for us. If they admitted me, which I presume they would, Rich would then carry the suction machine back out to the van because we would not need it. He would also take my wheelchair to the van. Then he would come back with my laptop bag and my ventilator. Now when you get to the ER with respiratory problems, again, they see you very quickly. It was amazing to see the people at St. Vincent using only paper records and no computers. It had been a few days now, and they were getting into a routine, but it was clearly difficult for them. It was just amazing to watch them work. When I told the doctors and nurses what I'd been through at Methodist, especially checking myself out AMA, they didn't hesitate to admit me. They warned me that they were not operating at peak efficiency because their computers were down. I told them I was aware of that. I said, I feel safer here with you guys under these difficult conditions on your worst day than I would be at Methodist on their best day. They had no difficulty lifting me from my wheelchair onto the gurney. I had Rich hang on to my feet as I was being lifted, because in the past I got my feet tangled up beneath me when someone had tried to lift me like that, and it's quite painful. The manual lift went smoothly, and they got me undressed. Another chest x-ray confirmed there was still some opacity, which meant slight pneumonia. I spent so much time at St. Vincent ER that I see familiar faces, and they recognized me as well. I felt like this place was my second home. I really was happy to be there. I was assigned a room about 4 p.m., and they always give you a bath when you first arrive in the ICU. By the time they finished, Rich was there with my laptop and my ventilator. He left around 5. He had tickets to the Indianapolis Indians baseball game that night. And there was also a Pacers NBA playoff game on TV that he was recording and I would watch live. I told Rich, just leave my wheelchair and everything in the van and leave it parked in the driveway. Then he could go home in his car. Josh later said Rich looked pretty tired. Again, I'm so blessed to have someone like him in my life. By the time I got to the ICU, they all said, "Hey Chris, we heard what happened to you at that other hospital. That must have been scary." News of my misadventures reached the ICU from the ER before I did. Now this was Friday, May 17. By Tuesday, May 21st, both the doctors and I felt I was ready to go home, and I was released. The stay at St. Vincent was uneventful. I had wonderful nurses, and I could tell lots of stories about them, but that's not important right now. It was just a very pleasant visit. I had to wait until about 6 p.m. for an ambulance to take me home. I wasn't going to make Carol come and get me dressed and take me home again herself. By this time, Barb was home from the hospital and doing really well. Back at home, throughout the day on Wednesday, the 22nd, I still needed breathing treatments and significant suctioning, way more than I had needed the previous day in the hospital. In the late afternoon, we did a breathing treatment, and it broke up a bunch of congestion. We had to struggle to suction it all out. I was having serious difficulty breathing. Barb has an oximeter, so we checked my oxygen level, and it was in the low 80s, which is where hers was when she went to the hospital. Fortunately, after I caught my breath, we got it back up into the low 90s, which is where it needed to be. We also took my temperature, and that was in the high 99s. I made the difficult decision. I had to go back to St. Vincent. I called the hospital to see if they were open to ambulance patients, and they said no. That was surprising, because while I was still there, they said they were reopening completely. I was up in my wheelchair, so I could go by van, and Josh agreed to take me. I offered to go by ambulance to Eskenazi Hospital. I wasn't going back to Methodist, that was for sure. Josh said he didn't mind taking me. That was a wonderful gesture. I asked him, "Are you comfortable with leaving Barb home alone?" Because she's still recovering. But Barb had to phone in her vital signs to the hospital periodically, so she was still under the care of the people at the hospital, even though she was home. Josh was confident she would be okay, and so was she. So again we packed up my suction machine, ventilator, laptop, and loaded all of that and me into the van. We did the same procedure I had done with Rich. When I got to the ER, they lifted me out of the chair onto the gurney. Carol arrived around 6:30. Josh took her car, and she would drive the van. We still weren't sure if I was going to be readmitted. I might have to get back into the wheelchair, back into the van, and go home. But eventually, another chest x-ray showed some congestion, and they decided to admit me again. Carol took the wheelchair to the van and brought back the ventilator and the laptop. Then I told her she could go home. I forget what time I made it to the ICU. Another bed bath upon arrival, and then I finally got on my ventilator and got to sleep. The next morning, Thursday, May 23rd, I had the same pulmonary doctor that I had before. I don't recall his name. We talked about the situation and agreed we'd both done the right thing by sending me home. He said, I trusted that if you needed to come back, you would, and in the end, you did. So no second guessing our decisions. I really like the guy. I had another peaceful and uneventful stay until Saturday, May 25th. I told the doctors I wasn't going to push them to send me home. But if I was going to go home soon, it had to be either Saturday or Monday. Sunday would be the Indy 500, and the traffic around my neighborhood would make it impossible for me to get home. The ambulance picked me up around 6 p.m. Saturday evening, and I was home in bed by 7. My weekend home health aide, Shatoria, had to take an Uber to get to my house Sunday morning because she's temporarily without a vehicle. They had to fight through the race day traffic to get to my house. By the time she got me up, most of the traffic had cleared, and we gave her a lift home. The race was delayed by rain, but the weather cleared mid-afternoon, and they completed all 500 miles. During the opening ceremonies, there was a flyby of the Air Force Thunderbirds. I went outside to watch them, but they flew by so low I could not see them above the treetops in the neighborhood. Usually I can see the military flyby, but this time I only heard it. Normally the race is blacked out in the Indianapolis area, but I can watch it on streaming using a VPN to mask my location. Because of the rain delay, the Speedway allowed the blackout to be lifted. That meant I could watch the race on cable on our big screen TV instead of on my computer monitor streaming. It was a very exciting race with a number of crashes. Fortunately, no one was hurt. And there were several passes for the lead during the final few laps. Joseph Newgarden was victorious for the second year in a row. It was the first back-to-back win for any driver since 2000-2001 wins by Helio Castroneves. I was glad to be alive to see it. I'm recording this on Monday, June 3rd. I've been doing well ever since I came home. I've done some breathing treatments in the morning as a preventative measure, but my lungs are doing quite well. The doctors never did decide whether I had some sort of respiratory virus, like Barb had, or if it was just the fumes from the 3D printer. I think it was the fumes, but we'll never know for sure. Also, we discovered that my home suctioning machine wasn't working right. It could have been that Wednesday when I was back home, and we had so much trouble getting me cleared up, that I really didn't need to go back to the hospital. I thought we were having trouble getting my lungs clear because they were in bad shape, but it might have just been that the machine wasn't working. We called my supplier, and they brought out a replacement machine on Memorial Day, and that was much better. So I've been able to get my lungs clear quite easily. Again, I don't know if that contributed to the problem, but it sure didn't help. Before we sign off, I need to explain My life is getting quite complicated right now. Some of it involves some exciting work I'm doing on a new assistive technology project that's going to take a lot of my time. But the rest of it involves some major life changes and some tough decisions that I'm making. As a result, I cannot commit to producing a new podcast every week on a regular schedule. I do fully intend to continue the podcast, but I cannot guarantee when new episodes will arrive. This isn't the end, it's just a new phase. I can't say when the next episode will be, but when I return, I'll continue with more stories about my history as a race fan, including the first time I ever attended the Indy 500 in person. I had intended to get out at least 2 more episodes about racing before the race itself. Well, that didn't happen. Anyway, after we wrap up the racing series, we'll go back to more stories about my college days, especially about my mentors, Dr. John and Judith Gersting. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 per month. You'll get early access to the podcast and other exclusive content. Although I have some financial struggles, I'm not really in this for the money, but every little bit helps. As always, my deepest thanks to my financial supporters. It means more to me than words could ever express. And thanks also to all the people who helped get me through this crisis. Even if you cannot provide financial support, please post links and share the podcast on social media so I can grow my audience. I just want more people to hear my stories. All my back episodes are available. I encourage you to check those out if you're new to the podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or other feedback, please feel free to comment on any of the platforms where you found the podcast. I'll see you next week. I'll see you next time, whenever that's going to be, as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.